and welcome to this week's episode of On the Line. I'm Will.
And I'm Kayla, and surprise!
We're releasing early. It's March 2nd, but we have a special guest with us, David Jose. And David, do you want to tell us why we're releasing on March 2nd?
It's Dr. Seuss Day.
Oh, my word.
Yeah. It's National Reading Across America Day, Dr. Seuss Day, and we are so excited to bring you this special episode. And we have a very special guest coming up soon that David hooked us up with. David, do you want to tell me who it is?
It's Brian J. Jones. He's the author of Becoming Dr. Seuss, Theodore Geisel, and the Making of an American Imagination. He also wrote the biographies of George Lucas and Jim Henson.
And Washington Irving.
And Washington Irving.
He's such a cool dude. Very, very talented and very motivated by pop culture. And oh my gosh, what a wealth of knowledge he is.
Definitely.
I mean, Dr. Seuss, George Lucas, Jim Henson.
Washington Irving.
Well, I mean, those three of the 20th century.
Yeah.
Those names of the 20th century.
Of course, yeah.
Brian has the lockdown on writing books about pop culture figures.
Yeah, the creative types. I mean, and he got so much access to, like, especially the Jim Henson stuff. It's kind of fascinating to hear how he was able to become part of that project and be the one to write that story, along with, you know, going about it a different way with George Lucas's and even Dr. Seuss. Just like, that's not someone he was familiar with as he was a kid, and he had to just kind of learn about this person and write this fascinating story.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of being a kid, it is Dr. Seuss Day, and I know that we all grew up and love Dr. Seuss. So what is your guys' favorite Dr. Seuss book?
Man, I remember my mom reading a lot of those to me when I was young, and honestly, we kind of talked about it in the episode. Dr. Seuss, I found out, spoiler alert, has an imprint, so some books I thought were Dr. Seuss didn't turn out to be, so you'll find that out in the episode. But going back to it, my favorite is probably Hop on Pop.
The Grinch Who Stole Christmas is mine.
Both are excellent.
That's a good one.
So I have two, because one of mine I feel like nobody really talks about. It's called In a People House, and I think it's two birds who go around and talk about the things that you find in a people house. It's amazing, and I was obsessed with it when I was a kid, but nobody knows anything about the book. So In a People House, it's great. Highly recommend. But also Green Eggs and Ham.
I know, Green Eggs and Ham was so silly when you'd hear it read back to you as a kid. I mean, just hearing your mom or dad just have to recite all that. I would not eat it with a bat. I would not eat, like, that was funny to me. And that's just that creativity that you get. And even working within those boundaries that Dr. Seuss had to work in with the pedagogy.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
Yes. And we talked to Brian J. Jones about that some too, about how, you know, he incorporated reading words that specifically appealed to younger readers, and also how his influences in knowing the German language played into writing his books.
Silly words he came up with too, yeah.
So interesting.
Well, he's able to take biography and make it really fun for the reader.
And outside of his books, we got to talk to him a little bit about just his life, things that he loves, and even, you know, back in the old days when he used to run a comic shop.
Yes,
Yeah.
I knew you guys would connect on that level.
Yeah, we definitely did.
For sure. So here it is, Brian J. Jones on the Line.
Did you
and I gotta tell you, I was busting your chops about the time thing, because my wife, who travels all the time, like she's in DC right now, and she'll call me and at like, you know, 10 o'clock DC time, and she'll be like, "Did I wake you up? I know it's late." I'm like, "It's 8 o'clock here." Like she always knows there's a time difference, and she's always going the wrong way.
Yeah, it's funny. I had like told everyone in the office like the time that we were going to be calling you and everything, and no one batted an eye. We're so used to like adjusting for Eastern time because I'm from Florida, so like I'm just used to having to do that so much. So I totally brain farted. And actually we were sitting here ready to record the episode at like 6 o'clock our time, and I was just like, "Oh, this is the problem." Yeah. So anyway,
Right, I was still in the car at that time.
Well, we're glad you're here with us now.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to be here. Love this work.
So did you get the message I had sent you, or like the document I had sent you by any chance? Did you get to look that over, or?
Yes.
We kind of start things off with 3 I statements, we call them, and it's just kind of because we keep these somewhat brief and we're trying to, you know, let people know a little bit of personal life. Do you have 3 I statements for us?
Yeah, I do. And this is probably won't come as any surprise to people who know what I do, which is I'm a biographer of creative geniuses, but that's not my first I. Well, maybe that was my first side note. I forgot my line. So I'll go ahead and just say I am a biographer of creative geniuses.
Okay.
So let me add one more. I am somebody who always watches all the credits of a movie.
Nice. I like that. I appreciate that, actually, because I do
Yeah.
the same thing, especially since Marvel movies came out. It makes you want to like sit around and like wait till the end. But I think I've always done that, honestly. I went to school for audio engineering, so I always like to see who the key grip was at the end or something like that, you know?
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, Marvel's brilliant putting the stinger at the end, like forcing you to sit through it. But we have always done that, and we started doing it with our daughter when she was very small, because we would sit and read like the names out loud that were funny. and so I mean, and she is grown up and married now, and she makes her own husband crazy because they go to a movie. She's like, "We're sitting through the credits."
We're sitting through all the credits.
So they can make fun of all, it's like we used to always watch Bones, and I can't remember what exactly his job was, but one of the guys' name was Eric Messerschmidt. Like we always had to say it that way. Eric Messerschmidt.
That's funny.
So, do you do it on TV shows and movies, or?
Yep. Nope. We do it on everything.
Nice.
Nice.
I respect that.
We're big pains in the ass that way. So yeah, nobody likes to watch. And even on like Netflix now, where it's like skip the opening credits, we're like, absolutely not.
Well, the opening credits are the best part on some things, you know?
And I hate that Netflix actually, like, when the show's over, they're like jumping to the next episode. I'm like, no, go back.
Shrink it down so you can't even see what's going by on the screen.
Oh God, yeah, I hate that.
So, would you say that you're a binge watcher then, or no?
I mean, it didn't bother me that like The Mandalorian was not bingeable. I know some people don't like that. They want to sit and watch them all at one time. I always suspect what they're doing is they're like, well, I'll get CBS All Access just for the free trial for a week and just binge watch everything.
Yeah.
Which we don't do. But, I mean, so here, probably this is what a lot of people are. I never planned to be a binge watcher, and I end up being a binge watcher.
Yeah, I think I'm guilty of that.
That's the same
too.
thing that happens with me. I'll say, I don't want to watch like a 3-hour movie, but then I'll go ahead and sit and watch 3 hours of another show. And I'm like, well, I could have just watched the 3-hour movie. I still haven't seen Endgame. I'm embarrassed to admit that, honestly.
Isn't that terrible? It's like my wife and I were doing that with, because Better Call Saul, which we love.
It's a great show.
Like the third season, or, the one right before the one that's getting ready to start, just dropped on Netflix. And so we're like, well, we have to start watching this because then the newest season is going to start. And we're like, well, we'll just watch one, while we eat dinner. Well, we watched them all in 3 days.
Yeah, that's what's been happening with my husband and myself with Schitt's Creek.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I can't watch just one.
Though. Now you're all caught up. You're all good to go.
Now we're all caught up, and I can't wait for the new season to start. I just think that show is so freaking great.
Yeah, for sure.
So you love credits. Do you have another I statement for us?
So my second one is that I am a hardcore Beatlemaniac, meaning I am part of the problem.
All right.
It's like people always say they shouldn't be releasing all this crap. Nobody wants to hear the Circle of Light piece that like Paul McCartney recorded in his avant-garde. I'm like, bring it on. I
want all of it.
I am part of the problem. So I will read anything. I will watch anything. I mean, I just shoot it right in my veins.
Do you have a favorite era or album of the Beatles? Or is it just everything?
My favorite, well, it is hard. It's like, it's like you would say my top 10 favorite Beatles songs has 100 songs on it. My favorite album is definitely Abbey Road. And of course, so I just bought like the, $59, humongous, like every outtake version of it that just came out.
That 50th anniversary just happened, right?
Yeah, and it was actually, what's weird is it's like full circle. Abbey Road was actually the very first album I ever bought with my own money. And just so your listeners know, I am not old enough to have been alive when the Beatles were around.
Well, yours was...
let me put it this way. I was born the year Sgt. Pepper came out. I'll say that.
Okay, so 67? What?
67,
yeah, okay,
so,
67.
So in like 1979 or something, when I got like my own like real stereo, and this is back in the days of vinyl, like the first album I bought with my own money, I actually bought Abbey Road, a Magical Mystery Tour with my own money.
Well, yours was way cooler than mine, because mine was Michael Bolton's The One Thing, and it was on CD. So I mean, I think you win on that one.
That's yeah. I think mine was a Moby one.
So that's my favorite. My favorite era is probably now like just, it's one of those, it's the biographer and the dramatist in me. It's like, I love the period in their last 3 years when like they're always bickering and you think the wheels are going to fall off, and they somehow always manage to keep it together.
Yeah.
And just keep putting out one more brilliant piece after another. But it's like this great, Shakespearean tragedy when it finally happens. So I just think it's so fun. I have watched Beatles Anthology on DVD like 9,000 times.
If it was a VHS, you would have definitely worn it out by now.
Well, it's funny. I actually bought the VHS collection at back when it was Price Club, back when it first came out.
Okay.
And I got it home, and it was like, I think 8 VHS tapes, and I had one of the tapes in there twice. Like there was a mistake, and like there was like tape 6 wasn't there, but tape 5 was there twice. And like Price Club, I went back to exchange it, and they didn't have it anymore, and I was just crushed. It took me years before I finally got it on DVD that I had like a flawed VHS set.
And now you appreciate it even more, though. But.
That's right.
So obviously, you've written so many great biographies on these creatives, like you said. Did I cut you off? Did you have another I statement?
I have 3. One more.
Okay, let's hear it. Sorry.
My final I is that I believe Greedo didn't ever squeeze off a single shot.
Wow. I don't think I've heard that opinion.
I don't think I know what that means.
I definitely
am a Han shot first guy all the way through.
Well, I'm 100% Han shot first all the way, but I don't know if I've ever thought about. I guess I always just assumed Greedo did fire a round off, but I don't know. I'll have to go back and look at the footage.
No, Greedo never got a shot off. They amended it later, so it was like self-defense. So initially, like Han cocks his pistol under the table and just blows him away.
Well, I think that's important. I think that I can go on record now saying that I'm a Han shot first person as well. So
a lot of the purists will just say Han shot, but I'm like, there's no context for that. Don't be cute.
So, I mean, I guess now that's kind of an interesting segue because, I mean, you did write the George Lucas biography, among others, like Jim Henson, obviously, Washington Irving, and it being Dr. Seuss Day, the reason we're talking to you is you wrote Becoming Dr. Seuss, the Theodore Geisel, and the Making of an American Imagination that came out last year. So you have a lot of these great creative types under your belt.
Yeah, and it's funny. It wasn't necessarily on purpose. It was interesting. I think it was somebody in the Washington Post was like, "Oh, and Jones is the documentary of like the great American imagination," and I was like, "Wow, I really like that. I'm gonna use that." But it wasn't actually intentional. And somebody else said, "Oh, you've got like the bearded trio now."
Oh yeah, that's true. I didn't think about that tie-in. Yeah.
Except for Irving, but it all happened. I wish I could tell you it was all planned out from the beginning. Like George Lucas, I will tell you it was, and like George Lucas, that would be a lie.
I've always wondered.
Yeah, no, I got into biography mainly because I am a Christmas junkie, which is another I. And
there you go.
And I had read this really interesting book called The Battle for Christmas that was all about the history of Christmas and why Americans in particular like have all these traditions that we swear are ancient, old school English traditions, and we make it all about children. And this book is like, no, the American colonies, the governors outlawed Christmas for 100 years because people used it as an excuse to get drunk, and then they would come to your door and they would sing, and then if you didn't feed them, they would drag you out of the house and beat you up, which is still in like We Wish You a Merry Christmas, where they're like, bring us some figgy pudding, bring it right here, like oh, and so basically like Christmas is like just this terrible holiday. But essentially what happened is, as it said in this book, Washington Irving invented it. Like Washington Irving wrote the series of short stories called Old Christmas, where his narrator's like going to this old English, house out in the middle of England, and they're having all these Christmas traditions and the Yule log, and everyone's eating and drinking and having fun, and kids are singing. And like Irving's making this all up on the fly.
Wow.
That's amazing.
And he's doing it brilliantly. He's like footnoting it and citing all these old sources, and there's just enough truth in it to like look real. I mean, he's like the first he's like Christopher Guest almost.
Wow, I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
I didn't either, and like that was completely new to me. Like, and when I read that, and since he's writing like he's like the guy you read in high school or college. Like, do we really have to read this old dead guy who was just America was barely a country, blah blah blah. Anyway, I was really expecting like to read Nathaniel Hawthorne. Like, I'm waiting for this very stilted Puritan prose, and he's really funny, and he's like breaking the fourth wall all the time, and he was just super fun to read. So I wanted to read more about Irving, and there had not been a biography of him in like 85 years.
Wow.
So, and all his letters and papers had just been collected and like bound and were like stored at the University of Wisconsin. So, so that was the book that I really wanted to read. I want to know more about him. He turned out to be hugely fascinating, and to this day, it's still my wife's favorite subject.
And that's kind of how you proceeded from there as well. Because I mean, I know I've kind of heard you talking before about you looking at the Jim Henson wiki page and realizing that there just wasn't, all these citations were from just these books that weren't biographies. So you saw a need for something.
You've listened to the old material and stolen my stories. Yeah. So that was exactly. So I got done with Irving, and my agent's like, "What's next?" I'm like, "I have no idea at all. I hadn't really planned to do another one, and it was just one of those weird things. I was on, and I wish I knew why I was there, but I was on his Wikipedia page, and there was no bio, and that was the start of that one. So,
you got access to so much good information in that, and from what I understand, I mean, you spend a good part of the time getting the trust of the family and building a relationship with them to where they would allow you to access that. I mean, as I guess, like in our day and age, you have so many people who are like branding businesses or branding themselves. In a way, you are kind of branding yourself as the perfect person to tell their story. Can you talk about that a little bit? Like, how did you get their trust?
Yeah, because and they didn't know I was going to be the perfect person, because the only book I had was Irving, and I did send it to all the people in the family. I'm just like, it's sort of my calling card. And God, it's such a long story. I won't get into all. But Lisa Henson is so smart. When I actually met with her, their press person was sitting in the room at the same time, and she said about the Irving book, and Lisa Henson goes, "Oh yeah, that's what it's like to be like a rock star in the 19th century." And I'm like, that is exactly the way I pitched that book. Yeah. Like she is so smart. Cool. But yeah, they had actually, and I didn't know this at the time, they had been burnt before. So right after Jim died, they had been approached by another writer who wanted to write his story, and they gave him, a lot of access, and he got to interview a lot of people who were still living, who were not when I set out to do it, and wrote this very dark version of his life, which I don't quite know how you could get that. It was interesting because I had access to copies of interviews he'd done with people who were deceased, so I was able to read those papers. The rest of the stuff I didn't see, and you can in his interview transcripts, you can see him trying to steer people in certain dark alleys, and no one will go there. So I don't know how he could have done that. Anyway, so that's just giving you the context that they had been stung. Yeah. So they were very skeptical of letting somebody else in, and they're not going to fall for that again.
You had to build that trust for sure.
So it took a long time to sort of, just get to know them and talk with them. And finally what broke it open, and I think I told this story before too, is I was living in DC at the time, and I've lived in DC the last 30 years. I just moved out west like 4 months ago. Wow. I grew up out here, so it's a homecoming, but it's so weird to be back. And so I went down to the Library of Congress, and I pulled, because Jim grew up in Maryland. He grew up the next county over from where I lived. Went to the University of Maryland, lived right there in that county. So I went down to the Library of Congress, and I pulled every local newspaper story on him from when he was in high school and college, when he had just broken into TV and was doing Sam and Friends. And I wrote it from like this very local perspective. And it was a little bit, I looked up like a history of TV and how TV was invented, but just was trying to put his talent and perspective of the time. But I had all this really great information from people who worked with him. We were talking about what a genius he was. And I sent that off to them. And I mean, and I said, this is the way I would do this. This is the way I like to use my materials. And this is, I want Jim to tell the story as much as possible. And, Lisa's the oldest of 5 kids. So she's kind of the one they all look to. And she said to me at one point, "If we tell you no, are you still going to do this?" And I said, "Well, I really think I need those archives." And their archives are privately held. They're not sitting in a university. They're inside the Jim Henson Company. So you can't just stroll in off the street. Awesome. So I said, I don't think you can do it unless you've got your archival information. You've got the goods. That's the only way to do this right. So no, I wouldn't do it that way. So after I sent her this, this sort of draft chapter, that really broke it open at that point. That was when they saw the way I was going to do it, that I really wasn't up to shenanigans, that I wanted to let, the facts tell the story, let Jim tell the story. And that really kicked it open. And at that point, you're sort of a made man. They give you access to the archives, and you say, "God, I would really love to talk to Dave Goles about Gonzo." And they're like, "Oh, well, we have Dave's phone number." So
that's awesome.
So that was really great. So it really made it great. And the other really generous thing about them is they did not insist it be authorized, meaning that they didn't have final say on it. Because an authorized biography, if somebody doesn't like what's in it, they can torpedo it, or they can make you go back and rewrite it. All they asked me was, we really want to see the first draft, and we want you to take our input seriously. I actually gave them every draft I had, because it was just a better book that way with them. And it had to be really interesting for them, a widow and 5 kids who all knew pieces of the story and had parts of it, but to hear it, told back to them in third person by a stranger, I think it's actually a very brave thing to do, and to their credit, they were great about it. I had made like one major chronological error in the book, which they all jumped on. But apart from that, I mean, there were little things that they all kind of discuss amongst themselves, and somebody'd say, "I don't really like that," and another one would say, "Well, I don't have any problem with that." And again, the last word was mine, but I did take all their input seriously. So again, the whole point is like they were very generous with their time and with their consideration and with their input. It was a really once in a lifetime experience.
Well, I feel like if you can get someone to write a biography of a loved one, and they do due diligence and do their research and really spend time to make it, something special, like that's something to be proud of.
Well, thank you. And let's compare that and contrast it with the George Lucas book, where I had no access to him.
Yeah.
Because he had been stung as well too. You've probably read it if you're enough of a Star Wars nerd. The 1983 Skywalking that Dale Pollock wrote, and it's a fine book, and he's got the goods on Lucas's childhood. Came out in '83, right as Lucas is finishing, Return of the Jedi. So it's a million years ago now. Lucas hated that book, hated it, and vowed that he would never speak to another biographer again. Now, fortunately, that cat talks way more than he thinks he does. So there's tons and tons of stuff out there. But, Dale Pollock, and I sent him a note on this one. I said, Dale, thanks for ruining it for the rest of us. But that was one I had actually made a run at him, because he sent my editor, he didn't send this to me, which still hurts my feelings terribly, sent a note to my editor after the Jim Henson book came out saying, Jim was a good friend of mine, and this book was great. Like, he loved the Jim Henson bio. And I was like, this is fantastic. He's dying to be done. Not so much. I mean, I wrote him a very long email, like as on polite bended knee as I could get without being too pathetic, and told me no. And what everybody told me later is, wow, the fact he even told you no is huge. Usually they don't tell you anything. Yeah. But then after that, there's so much material, and so many things have been written about Star Wars, and a lot of people have. It's just a matter of knowing where to find it. The other hard thing I had, though, and this is, I really got spoiled after Jim Henson, because a lot of people I wanted to talk to who knew Lucas or had worked at Lucasfilm had non-disclosure agreements.
So there's really no one to go to as a reference. You just had to go through the source materials and anything that George Lucas had done interviews in the past, or
and read secondary material, and you could find some people Gary Kurtz talked with me, but you've got it's one of the things you have to be aware of as a biographer. People have agendas, and Gary Kurtz is working very hard on legacy preserving the same way George Lucas is. So you have to you have to sort of peer through the bars every once. I talked to Randall Kleiser, his college roommate who directed Grease, which is so weird.
But I guess you kind of touched on it, like preserving the legacy. One of the cool things that I think goes with all three, and I don't know too much about Washington Irving, but especially George Lucas, Jim Henson, and Theodore Geisel or Dr. Seuss, they all did such a good job in keeping their brand not watered down, like keeping other people from having a hand in it. They all wanted the control over what products were being released with their name on it, so that they had complete control on that. Is that something you found as well?
Yes, and and what's even weirder is it's the same way with Washington Irving.
Really?
Again, Washington Irving is like our first absolute superstar celebrity. I mean, like, if he needed to renovate his house, he would write a book because he knew it would be a bestseller. So much that he got accused of bookmaking. But he was one of these guys who cultivated this brand. Like, he had this very public persona that was very unlike his private life. His public persona was Jeffrey Crayon, who wrote the sketchbook and wrote Legend of Sleepy Hollow and wrote Rip Van Winkle. He was he's considered very erudite and very man about town. And Irving himself, there was never a party he didn't land at, and he always managed to show up when you were putting dinner on the table. But this Jeffrey Crayon persona, he was content to let everybody think that was him because he was an absolute mess. He was always breaking out in these nervous rashes constantly, and he would read his reviews, which is something I don't read Goodreads, and Irving would have read his Goodreads review and then sulked for a year. So I mean, just an absolute mess. So he was another guy kind of on that same brand, really cultivated that brand, cultivated that personality, and that is a through line with all four of the people I've written about, all very serious about protecting, I mean, what I loved about Jim Henson, he would come right out and say, he's like, look, we're not putting out junk. This is my name on it. This is the Muppets on it. People have expectations. Exactly. I want to see everything. And George Lucas was the same way. And Dr. Seuss, Ted Geisel, was so much that way that he barely merchandised anything in his lifetime.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, one thing that I'm sorry, I did do some research and listen to podcasts, so I might be citing another one. But something you brought to my attention just through listening to you earlier this week was, my mom used to read to me, Are You My Mother? And I always saw that book with the Dr. Seuss brand on it, and I always thought that was Dr. Seuss. And you kind of blew my mind the other day when I heard you say that it wasn't Dr. Seuss and it was just this imprint that he had. Was it on Random House or something?
Yeah, so he, based on the success of Cat in the Hat, which, and again, this was all news to me too. I was not a Dr. Seuss kid or a Dr. Seuss fan per se, but based on the success of Cat in the Hat, which what makes that book so special is it's got pedagogy behind it. It's got the Dick and Jane educator-approved word list, and it does not deviate from that list. And it was a book kids wanted to read. That's what made that book so special. So after the success of that book, Bennett Cerf, and it was actually Bennett Cerf's wife, Phyllis, came to him and said, let's start an imprint in Random House that uses those word lists. It has that sort of rigor behind it, but it's books kids want to read. And you're the president of that imprint and editor-in-chief. You're in charge. And so he goes out there and recruits all these great, he's the one who discovers and recruits the Berenstain Bears, Stan and Jan Berenstain. But he recruits, Roy McKee and PDJ and all these guys. And when I got ready to write the Dr. Seuss book, I had so many people who said, just like you, oh my God, Go Dog Go. I love Go Dog Go. Oh my God, Are You My Mother? They're all written by the same guy, neither of which is Dr. Seuss. Yeah. But because they're on that imprint, he's got final say and final touch on the cover design, and it's got sort of that Seussian lettering on the covers of it, and it's very brightly colored. And it feels like a Dr. Seuss book, even though it's not.
Yeah, it really does. Like a lot. I think my favorite was One Fish, Two Fish, which I am pretty sure was.
That one is. You're correct. Yeah.
Good. So one of the questions that I had in kind of preparing for this interview, you put out the Jim Henson biography pretty shortly, followed by the George Lucas. Then we've got the Dr. Seuss one that came out last year. I'm not a writer. I don't know what that process is like, but the idea of working on so many big projects at the same time kind of overwhelms me and boggles my mind. I guess what I want to ask, though, is were you focused on one project and then moving on to the next one and then moving on to the next one, or is it kind of an all-at-once approach?
No, I can't overlap. I actually went back and looked at my notes on this during when I was moving out here, and I dug out all those boxes and stuff. I was actually pitching and proposing the Jim Henson book before the Irving book came out, but not by much. Like Irving came out in like January of 2008, and I looked at my notes from the first time I went and did research at Library of Congress, and it was like November of 2007. So it was like really close. So I'd clearly already had that conversation with my agent about it, but there was no overlap. I wasn't ever writing or researching the two at the same time, and that's always held. When the Jim Henson book was done, I didn't know about Lucas until after my editor called me. He's like, "Oh, George Lucas sent us a nice note." And so I never have overlap. Now, the only issue that I have is I have always had a full-time job at the same time as I'm doing it. Oh. So that can get hard. And I'm not as young as I used to be. So like when I was writing the Irving book, I would get up at 5 a.m. And I'm not a morning person as it is anyway, but I would get up at 5 a.m. and I would write till about 6:30. And then I would drive down to Rockville and go to work. Wow. And then come back in the evening and, work again from maybe 8 until, 11 o'clock. The Henson book, that one wasn't quite as crazy because the elected official I'd been working for decided not to run again. So I had like 2 years off where I couldn't work on that one. Okay. And my wife has a great job. But back when I was writing Lucas, that was another one. And because I'm not as young as I used to be, I didn't get up in the mornings for that. But what I did instead was, I would get up at 6 in the morning and I would go off to work. And then as soon as I got home at 6 at night, I would write until 2 or 3 in the morning, and then start all over again. And I'm actually actually much better at night than I ever am in the morning. But that's always just been the hardest part so I think that's one of the reasons why I can't juggle projects, because it's already hard enough having a day job.
Right. Yeah. You're already juggling something else like that. But if it's something that you're passionate about, then it's worth it, I think.
Yeah, I think so too. And I don't know that organizationally I could do it, because I'm incredibly analog. As hard as I try, and I'm an early adopter on a lot of technology, but as hard as I try, I know a lot of even fiction writers who swear by like Scrivener, which is like an electronic organizer and note taking, and I just can't do it. It feels like a forced step to me. I'm still like write my notes by now. I'm not Robert Caro who's typing it out on a typewriter. Forget that. But it's like I'll still handwrite quite a bit of my notes, and I'll like scribble an outline, and then I'll just sit down on my computer and just write. I don't write a first draft. I just start going. But all my notes and like all my newspaper articles, all my research, it's like hard copy in the binders on the shelf, and that's the only way I can work. And I think maybe that's because I came up as a Hill staffer, and like this is back in the 90s before we had everything electronic, and that was just kind of the way I filed everything. I had everything in black binders, 3-hole punched, and on the shelf. Yeah.
It's funny because we obviously David hooked us up with you, David Jose, who works here at Sublime, and we thank him for that. But it's funny that you say that, because we always kind of joke with him because he's got the yellow legal pads all over the place. You know, he's got a different yellow legal pad for every project. But yeah, whatever helps keep you organized. I mean, we all have our different methods for sure.
Well, I think when you handwrite something, to me, I remember it.
Yeah.
So much better.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I'm definitely that way with, having, because I tend to work off an awful lot of, copies of newspaper articles and things like that. And I have those photocopied, and like for the Jim Henson project, I'll have one that just said, The Muppet Show. And it's this gigantic, like 3-inch binder just filled with newspaper clippings and TV thing. But there's something about having touched that paper and inserted it in there and flipped through it. I'll be writing and I'll be like, you know what? I think I remember a great quote about that. It's about halfway down through that binder. There's a picture on the right-hand side, and it's about 2/3 of the way down the page. Now I can't. It's not photographic memory. Like I can see the quote, but I'm like, I remember seeing that page, and it's on there someplace. And 9 times out of 10, I've gotten it right.
I identify with that so much. So
yeah, I think that tactile sense is the memory prompt for me.
It's important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You kind of mentioned that obviously you do have your primary job, and then these were just kind of secondary. I didn't know that Dr. Seuss, until he was in his 50s, was an ad man. I mean, he was working and making was he making ads and copy and stuff? Is that what it was?
Yeah, that's what was so fascinating to me with Dr. Seuss, because I'll step back, and you've probably heard these stories as well, because I tell this one a lot too. But I had a very different relationship with Dr. Seuss as a subject than I did with Henson and with Lucas and Irving, even to a certain degree. It's like Henson and Lucas I grew up with. Like I'm Star Wars Generation 1. I'm like Sesame Street Generation 1. Like I saw Dark Crystal in the theater. I saw Labyrinth in the theater. As Lisa Henson said, oh, so you're the one. But, so it's like, and so like, I always kind of knew when I was writing those books, like where you are on the timeline. Dr. Seuss, to me, like, I didn't learn how to read with Dr. Seuss. I didn't have Dr. Seuss was the dentist office book to me. So it's like, I didn't know, I think he wrote like 65 books in his lifetime. I could have named about 6. So it was a real learning experience for me to learn this whole story. And one of the things that shocked me is what you just brought up, is he doesn't really hit until he's 54 years old. He does have that day job. He's a very successful ad man for most of his career. And what's so hard to believe is all those other books that he writes before Cat in the Hat, which again is 1957, and he's been doing books since like 1938. So it's like Mulberry Street and Bartholomew Cubbins and Horton Hatches the Egg and Horton Hears Who. Like those books aren't selling well enough for him to earn a living, which is so hard for us to believe. I know, because after Cat in the Hat sells, like that's the rising tide that floats all boats. But he couldn't earn a living with it before. And so he's always, throughout his career, which is why I call this becoming Dr. Seuss, he's always looking for like, what's the better job for him? Is it advertising? Then at one point he's like, he wants to be a film writer and decides that that's miserable and goes back to kids' books. But it's like for a long time in his career, he doesn't really become what we think of till Dr. Seuss. I would argue till like even the late 60s. When he's in his 60s. So it takes him a long time. I did not know any of that. I look at him, I'm like, Dr. Seuss, icon, famous from moment one, successful moment one, just wasn't true.
It is timeless, though.
Yeah. Well, and that's such
It really is.
like, that's an important lesson to learn, I think, for any creative. Like, sometimes it takes a while to find where you're gonna hit, like, what's your mark.
Yeah, and somebody once asked me, they said, well, Jim Henson, always said, follow your bliss. Is that great advice? Well, it is, but I think Dr. Seuss would have said, well, I followed my bliss until it didn't pay, then I went looking for something else, which is what a lot of us do. As we're still trying to follow that bliss, we've got to keep the lights on. Mm-hmm. And so that's what he's doing with advertising work. And he's a very successful advertiser. He's Don Draper of 1938. He comes up with this ad campaign called Quick Henry the Flit for bug spray, which it's like, I'm going to date myself, but the closest I can come to it is, it was almost like, where's the beef? This thing, like this go-to punchline, this reference everybody knows.
Yeah.
Like it's in songs, it's in the punchlines of comedians. It's like this gigantic campaign that he's actually able to just keep regurgitating that punchline literally 17 years.
And the Jingle, like, I didn't know that he wrote the songs for the Grinch, the cartoon as well. I didn't know that either. But I mean, did that come from Jingle writing? Did he ever have a hand in Jingle writing that you know of?
Not really. I mean, he always loved to write the lyrics, and with the story with him, that's he's not Steven Spielberg in the sense that Spielberg at age 8 is like filming his trains crashing together and kind of knows what he wants to do. Dr. Seuss is never like that. You never really see when he's like 10 years old that he's got this beautiful artistic sense and he's like the savant and he's like, he doesn't have that. But the one thing that he does have going on is, even in high school, as a senior in high school, he writes and performs a vaudeville show, and he plays the banjo himself, and he writes and he writes a play and he sings. So he always had this knack for writing lyrics. He's always really that's the way that's essentially the way they hooked him for the Grinch, is they're like, you get to write the songs. And they did that to him a lot of times. A lot of these other presentations, the Cat in the Hat, they're like, and you get to write the songs. That you always got him if you would do that with it. But that one shows up like back when he's in high school. That weird sense of language that he has, that ability to make up these funky words that sound so organic that you'd swear they existed until before he made them up. Mm-hmm. I think that knack for language comes partly from growing up the son of Germans and Germans, having this large German family and listening to that sort of wonderful and at times loopy German language where, like, if you want to make a word more expressive, you just keep adding on to the end of it. You don't add words, you add letters and, consonants all together that don't look like they belong together. I think that really shaped the way he looked at language, because if you look at some of his early work where he's making up animal names, he's not as good at it at first. Like, there's too many consonants together, so he gets much better at that. From having learned. But so you see some of that early on as well. But no, it's that lyric writing. I don't know that he ever wrote jingles. That's a great question, but I don't think I didn't find any evidence of that. It doesn't mean it didn't happen. Yeah,
it'd be interesting to find out. Just one of those popular jingles from back in the day was old Teddy Geisel,
Yeah, I mean, having that knack for the turn of phrase isn't quite a jingle, but he definitely. That wouldn't shock me. That's a great question.
So David told me that you ran a comic book shop for a while. Are comics an interest of yours?
I did. I managed a comic shop. Was it my senior year in college, and then for another year afterwards until I went out and got a real job. So I ran a comic store. I ran a comic store in like 88 and 89, and 89 remembers the year the Batman movie comes out. Yeah. And I was a huge Batman fan even before it was cool. So it's like, it's like our manager's like, Brian, go find me a bat. And I'd be like, you want Swamp Thing number 52 up on the wall? That's an appearance by Batman. I'd go stick him up on the wall.
That's a good guy to have in a comic book shop.
Oh my God. I was a huge fan, but I actually loved running a comic book shop. And you talk about a place where people, I hope I can say this, where people just want to stand around and bullshit. I mean, it's like the best place in the world to talk comics and just talk smack at each other.
Yeah, I worked at a comic shop here in Bowling Green. The comic book shop here, they kind of cross over now. So there's record store, comic book shops. So I worked more the music side of things, but I did end up getting into comics there. So your number one then is Batman, would you say?
My number one, it's always been Batman.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Any particular era of Batman or writer that you love the work of, or?
Yeah, so I'm a huge fan. To me, the definitive Batman artist is Jim Aparo. who basically drew every issue of Brave and the Bold from about 1968 through 1988 when it then was canceled, and then he became the regular artist on Batman and the Outsiders, written by Mike W. Barr. So like Jim Aparo is my guy. That's my Batman guy. Batman writers, like I love the Marshall Rogers, Steve Englehart run on Detective from the late 70s. I'm not a huge, I respect Frank Miller. I'm not a huge fan of his stuff, but if I had to pick my all-time favorite comic book writer, just in general, it would probably be Alan Moore, who does Watchmen and V for Vendetta, and writes beautiful one-offs. Like wrote a really memorable like 2-issue backstory. It was the second story in Vigilante, in the mid '80s. I mean, just it's always got an interesting, unique take on something. And I mentioned him the other day. Someone on Twitter said, what are 4 not fiction books, even if you're a nonfiction writer, like what are novels that influenced you? And I named Watchmen as one of mine because I love the way Moore Cliff hangs his chapters, and he always knows where he's going, and he's very clever with his transitions, and he's very good at organizing a whole lot of information. I just think he's absolutely brilliant.
That's awesome. Yeah, I particularly got into the Grant Morrison run of Batman for a while, and
I'm not quite done with that one. I had to go back and get all that in the paperbacks.
I stockpiled all the paperbacks for that.
That's what I'm most familiar with too.
Yeah. But no, I love Batman as well.
I'm making my way through Tom King's run right now.
Oh yeah, dude, Tom King's run is amazing. The Tom King, the run he did of Vision. Did you read that by any chance?
I have. That's another one I have the collect. I'm not a Marvel guy, so I never know quite what's going on with that. But I have the trade on that.
That Vision series was like perfect in my opinion. Like the artwork is amazing in it, and the story is just great. Like Tom King and Mitch Gerads, I believe, is the guy who does the artwork for it. Yeah, I love that arc. But
he's another guy who's really clever. Like I really like the way he's a great storyteller.
Yeah, definitely.
Yes. So the way we kind of wrap up all of our episodes is just to get you to reflect back on your career as a writer, all the things that you have researched. You've researched these great creatives and shared their life stories, but you also have your own experience as a creative. And I would love to hear maybe like a piece of advice or like a lesson that you've learned, something you always go back to, advice you could share with our listeners, I guess is a good way to put it.
Sure. I think one of the best pieces of advice you can give to anybody who is doing something creative, and even not necessarily for doing anything creative, just some things you like, is find your tribe. If you're a writer, join a writers group. And, there's a reason there's a Mystery Writers of America group. Yeah. And one of the best things I did, and this was when I think I was still finishing it, but is Biographers International Organization came up in about 2009. So Irving had already come out. But it was a place that I went where it's like you sit in rooms and you listen to people who all speak the same language. I mean, it's one of those, only at a biographers, I always say only at a biographers conference and at the Adult Video Awards can you walk up to somebody and say, "Who are you doing?" It's like you sit in these rooms and listen to people like, "Boy, but photo clearances, am I right?" And everyone applauds. They all have these similar weird experiences. So, for me, it was really helpful going in and just listening to people who've been through it talk about it. And I'm still an active member of Bio to this day. I sit on panels. I'm going to sit on a panel in New York in May on, interviewing and talking about the way I interview and, tips I give for interviewing. One of which is like, ask a question you know an answer to right away and find out where this person is. But so that's one of the I think one of the most important things to do is find people who do what you do, speak your language, will get your references, can be helpful, aren't going to judge you, but understand what you're all doing. You're all in this together, and you're all at different skill levels. And that was one of the greatest things about Bio is that no one ever really felt stupid because everybody, even one of the most powerful stories I ever heard was I'm going to name drop, which is so douchey, but is Debbie Applegate, who won the Pulitzer for her very first bio.
Wow.
Of Henry Ward Beecher. She was telling a story all about how she's working on another book at one point, and I said, Debbie, how's it going? And here's somebody who's won the Pulitzer and is brilliant. She's like, I can't see it. She's like, I'm blocked so badly. I feel like I've taken the engine apart and laid it out on the floor, and I can't put it back together. Wow. And I mean, to hear somebody who is just amazing. Tell a story like that, you're like, wow. It's just one of those moments you're just like, we are all in this together. It's just really great.
That is great. I can see that definitely being helpful, and I think naturally, especially here, we end up doing that. We all kind of click, and it's the same way. You're always going through the same things. You can talk to them about. Everybody knows exactly what you're talking about, and it's a judgment-free thing. So
it's such a relief too when you get around people who don't judge you and understand you, and I don't know. I think it allows you to be even more successful and creative too.
So all of these creative types and biographies you're doing, do you have anything on the horizon? Just as a final note?
I don't. And this is the longest I've ever been without a subject, which makes me very fidgety.
Yeah.
Because normally I know within a week or sometimes even before the book's done or before the book's out, at least, what the next one's going to be. This one I still don't know. I'm going to sit down here in the next couple of weeks and start working on a proposal for one.
Nice.
But I've got to see where they're going. I'm having a hard time, sort of like Debbie Applegate. I'm having a hard time seeing it right now. And that's a little tough for me because part of what I do is I always say I have to be able to hear it, and I can't quite hear this one yet.
You'll get there.
Yeah, definitely.
I hope so. Like I said, it's been almost, the book comes out in paperback in May, so it's been out, it'll be almost a year. It'll be a year in May. So this is the longest I've ever gone without being like, oh yeah, move on to my next one. So, because you were reading off the timeline, usually I'm 3 years between books. In this case, there's almost a year has ticked by. So.
But you did move across the country, so...
I did. Yeah, thank you very much for saying that. I hope my editor is listening.
Yes.
And, there's something to be said about having that time to recharge as well. I mean, when you have to put together these huge pieces, it's a nice time to really think about what you want to tackle next and get really involved in it. So that's awesome. I look forward to reading it and seeing what comes next.
Well, great. I hope I have something exciting for us all to read here.
Well, thanks so much for sitting down with us, Brian. I really appreciate talking to you.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, it's been a great episode.
Well, sure. Great. Thanks so much for inviting me. I'm glad we could make this work, even with my technological deficiencies on this end. So.
And my lack of understanding basic time zones.
It happens. And that was our interview with Brian J. Jones. A great one for sure.
Yeah, that was our first call-in interview, so it was really fun getting to work that out. And we kind of talk about it a little bit. There was some confusion in the time zones on my part. So that made us stay a little later than we thought. But he was really fun and accommodating, good to talk to. One thing I do want to clear up is... when I was nerding out with him about the Tom King run of Vision, I accidentally said that Mitch Gerads was the artist for Vision. He has been the artist on a lot of stuff with Tom King, like Sheriff of Babylon, and I think he even did some of the Batman run that Tom King did. But the artist for the Vision series I'm talking about is Gabriel Hernandez Walta, and I just wanted to clear that up because I know that maybe there's a nerd listening, or fellow nerd that is listening, that would call me out on that. And I just want to make sure I put that out there.
Well, good. A correction before anybody even said anything.
Exactly. Let's hope they listen to
this.
Let's just hope they listen to this outro.
Yes.
Because then they would know that next episode of On the Line, we're going to be talking to Kenny Landrum, the new car sales manager at Toyota Bowling Green.
So actually, when I first got into the business in 1999, I was just really trying to float, trying to stay above water. And I just did what my bosses told me to do. And that was go out, make friends.
Yeah.
Kiss babies. 71% of the people I was told buy from who they like, trust, and respect. So my job was to help my audience like, trust, and respect me.
I'm excited to have you all listen to Kenny's talk. He is such a fun, easygoing, laid-back guy. We chatted with him about how he branded himself and how that effort grew him in his position at Toyota of Bowling Green, but also his work with nonprofits and what he's doing on social media these days as well.
Yeah, that's going to be a really good episode. I can't wait for you to hear it. Also, to make sure you get it in your feed, you want to go ahead and subscribe to On the Line Podcast wherever you get your podcasts from.
And be sure that you give us a rating or a review. Those are always greatly appreciated.
Yes, we love it.
And we're trying to be more active on social, so follow us on Twitter. We're at On the Line Pod on Twitter, and we're on Facebook too. Just search for On the Line Podcast.
Well, that's it for this episode. We thank you again for listening, and have a good one.
Bye.